Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Jen Elder. I'm the director of the SAMHSA Homeless and Housing Resource Center, and we are glad that you're joining us today for a great discussion around loneliness among homeless and formerly homeless individuals. We received requests for this topic from many of you following our webinars and other events, so we hope that this helps meet your needs. We welcome you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll start with a quick disclaimer. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but the views and opinions expressed today don't necessarily reflect those of SAMHSA or HHS. Next slide. We have American Sign Language interpretation today, so we really appreciate them joining us. We also have live transcription from a human captioner, so we appreciate their support as well. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to reach out to us or send us a quick message using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Next slide. We're also very excited about introducing live Spanish interpretation on our webinars. For those of you who joined us last month, this is a new feature that we're adding to all of our events. So if you would prefer to hear this information in Spanish, you can choose the Spanish option at the bottom of your screen. If you need any assistance with this, please feel free to reach out to us. Next slide. Right, some final housekeeping instructions from me before we get to all the great information. We are joined by a great group today, so everybody's participant lines are muted and the chat feature is disabled, but we want to hear from you. So please use the Q&A feature to send feedback, to send questions. We ensure that the panelists get to view all of your questions and great comments throughout the webinar. We are thankful to, maybe 1,000 people who submitted questions before today's webinar. We have shared a summary of those with the presenters, and they are prepared to answer as many as we can get to at the end of the session. There'll be a good amount of time for Q&A. The slides are available now in English and in Spanish on our website, and we will put the link to that into the chat. We'll also have the recording available on the HHRC website tomorrow, and we'll send a listserv message around. At the end of the webinar, your browser should redirect you to an evaluation, and you can receive a certificate of participation upon completion of that. So with that, I believe that is all my housekeeping, and I am honored to turn it over to Dr. Jack Tsai, who helped coordinate this panel and is going to be our moderator today. Jack.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining. My name is Jack Tsai. I'm a professor of public health at the University of Texas. I've worked on issues related to homelessness for many years. And have worked with HHRC on various projects before. But today, I'm going to serve as the moderator for the webinar. So just to kind of describe the format of today's session. So we're going to have, we have a STEAM panel of 3 speakers. So we're going to have the speakers each present for about 20 minutes. And then after all speakers present, we'll have about 30 minutes left for Q&A. I think while they're presenting, feel free to use the chat function to write questions, and they will either answer them in the chat or we'll try to get to it in the Q&A. We also have some audience questions that were sent ahead of time, so I'm also going to try to ask those during the Q&A as well. Okay, without further ado, we're going to have the speakers. So each of the speakers have lots of experience, so I'm going to just kind of give you an abbreviated version of their bios. Also just point out, we have a geographically diverse panel of speakers. One speaker from the West Coast, one from the East Coast, and one from Australia. But our first speaker is Dr. Greg Townley. Dr. Townley is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Portland State University and co-founder of its university's Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative. He received his PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of South Carolina His research examines community inclusion and supportive housing of individuals experiencing serious mental illness and homelessness. He also helped develop and evaluate the Portland Street Response, an alternative first responder program in Portland, Oregon. With that, Dr. Townley, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Jack, for that nice introduction, and it's wonderful to be with you all today. My research focuses on community integration among adults experiencing serious mental health challenges and homelessness, but I want to be careful and clear that I'm not intending to conflate the experience of houselessness with the experience of serious mental health challenges. I think too often people assume that it's a one-to-one correlation, that all people with homelessness experience mental health challenges. Our best and most reliable data suggests that it's around a quarter. And so there are many individuals experiencing homelessness that are not experiencing serious mental health challenges. And there are many people with serious mental health challenges that are not experiencing homelessness. But my work does focus on that intersection. And so throughout today's talk, the populations I'm talking about are people who have experienced homelessness or are currently homeless and also have a serious mental health diagnosis like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. And I'd also like to say that I do my work very much in collaboration with community partners. I do lots of community-based participatory research where we involve people with lived experience as active leaders in the research process. I want to acknowledge Portland State University, where I'm employed, the Portland State Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative that I helped co-found at PSU, the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion of Individuals with Psychiatric Disabilities in Philadelphia, Cascadia Health, which is a nonprofit organization in Portland that supports people experiencing mental health challenges and also provides supportive housing. And also that some of the work discussed today is funded by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. But the views that I'm expressing don't necessarily represent the views of NIDLR. I'd love to begin a talk with the mantra of a mental health activist and anti-poverty activist, Pat Capone, who really would say that individuals with serious mental health challenges, individuals experiencing poverty, really have the same three fundamental needs as everyone else. They want a home, somewhere good to live, a job or something meaningful to do during the day, and a friend or someone to love. And that will really be the focus of today's talk, is that last piece, a friend or someone to love, someone to help combat loneliness. But the other pieces will also be really important to today's talk, the home and the job or something meaningful to do during the day. Community integration is a right. It's the fundamental rights of individuals with disabilities to live, work, engage with others, and enjoy recreational activities in the same manner as peers without disabilities. And in the 21st century, the ideal of individuals with disabilities being fully integrated into their communities remains an unachieved goal due to pervasive societal stigma, due to unaffordable and inaccessible housing, due to constrained opportunities for work and other meaningful ways to spend one's day. And as noted by Ware and colleagues, individuals with serious mental health challenges may be described as in the community, but not of the community. So my work is really focused on trying to have individuals with serious mental illness and individuals with experiences of homelessness being fully immersed, engaged in their communities as co-equal contributors to society. Traditionally, community integration has been primarily conceptualized as physical presence in the community, right? If someone's in the community, that's a form of integration. But that's not sufficient, right? It's important to be in the community and to participate in community activities. But beyond that physical integration, we really also need to be supporting social integration through social support, through having friends of one's own choosing, and also psychological integration, the sense of community or belonging that comes from being part of a collective. And so modern conceptualizations of community integration really do focus on physical integration, being part of the community and participating in the community, social integration, or so having social support, and again, psychological integration, or that sense of community, that sense of belonging. Community integration has been associated with a variety of well-being and quality of life outcomes, as well as improved mental health, reduced loneliness, increased social relationships, increased involvement in social and vocational activities, and also housing stability and satisfaction with housing. Loneliness among people experiencing serious mental health challenges and homelessness has been characterized as a silent killer that is at epidemic levels. And among people with SMI and people experiencing homelessness, loneliness has had especially high prevalence, with studies showing that 41% of adults with SMI are severely lonely, and up to 40% of people experiencing homelessness feel lonely. For all people, loneliness has been found to be associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia risk, elevated cortisol level, and early death, right? So it has major physical and physiological ramifications on individuals. And for people with serious mental illness specifically, loneliness has been associated with increased odds of general and psychiatric hospitalization, lower levels of self-efficacy related to disease management, depressive symptoms, and thoughts of self-harm. People experiencing homelessness who report being lonely are also less likely to contact counselors and social workers or visit physicians in the case of illnesses, okay? So it may impair their ability to reach out and engage in services, right, that will help them either find housing or health services they may need. Social support is highly important, right? People with larger support networks report greater perceived community integration. People with larger support networks and more satisfaction with their networks have higher scores in their recovery assessment scale, right? They report being at levels of recovery that are higher than individuals who have more constrained or smaller social networks. However, problems with social isolation and loneliness, as well as needs for companionship and intimate relationships, are among the most significant unmet needs for people with SMI and histories of homelessness. Often social networks are less diverse and interconnected, right? They entail a greater reliance on dependent ties and less reciprocity. So often individuals' relationships are more between a staff person or a care provider, which implies more of a top-down hierarchical relationship. And people really benefit from having relationships that are more horizontal, where there's a give and a take, right? People contributing to another person's satisfaction and happiness and quality of life and receiving that support back, right? So those more relationships tied to dependency or passivity tend to be at greater numbers among people experiencing homelessness and serious mental illness. And so it's important to find ways that we can have relationships of individuals' own choosing that entail more of a horizontal style of relating and not always the top-down or from a care provider to a care recipient. It's also the case that a network crisis can sometimes occur following a first major mental health episode and losses to social support experienced during episodes of homelessness, right? People may lose supportive networks that they had prior to being homeless. At the same time, there's also an experience that can occur when people come out of homelessness where they lose supportive networks that were really supportive to them while they were experiencing homelessness. They may lose when they enter into housing. And so it's really important to understand how different changes in people's lives based on a major mental health episode or an experience of homelessness may impact their ability to form supportive social relationships. People with serious mental illnesses do receive, and people experiencing homelessness have family and friend networks, right, that entail supportive roles of friends, parents, siblings, children. Research has shown that living with others helps to reduce isolation, that reciprocal relationships are most desired, as I was discussing previously. But that friends and family networks can be both a source of nurturing and support, and also a source of rejection, right? Okay, so it's not always that it's entirely positive. There can also be rejection that occurs from family and friends. And for that reason, people often do form relationships that are tied to the mental health system. They can be mental health staff, other consumers of mental health services, peers. These people help provide a safety net. And they can help connect people to community resources and hopefully to resources for establishing other support networks that are outside of the service system, as these should be the facilitator of supports rather than the primary supports themselves. And some research has shown that mental health staff may actively hinder individuals' efforts to participate, that they may be paternalistic or try to put kind of boundaries or safety nets around people that are too strict, right? That we set people up for relying on staff rather than really helping them form relationships in the community. And so that's important to know both the really beneficial role that mental health staff can play or housing staff can play, but also how they may hinder individuals from forming their own relationships in the community. There's another type of support that's a little bit newer that people refer to as a distal support. These are naturally occurring supports in the community that people receive through casual community relationships developed via regular contact with other individuals living and working in the same community. These are sometimes referred to as weak ties or loose ties, and they've been associated with higher life satisfaction and sense of belonging, and may be particularly critical for individuals whose close networks are truncated, right? If someone has fewer supports because they've been hospitalized for a period of time, or they've experienced homelessness, and they've come out of homelessness and now forming new relationships, these distal supports, these loose connections can be really important and become part of an individual's regular daily activities that can help them feel stability, right? And rely on people. And these are things like when you're in the community, we all have these, the coffee, person at the coffee shop, the barista that we see regularly, that we may not even know their name, but we know them, their face, and we smile, and we may have some casual conversation with them. Librarians, right? People we may see at a library regularly who ask us, about our favorite books and who begin to know some of our hobbies and interests. And the pharmacist, right? Someone who answers your questions, someone who helps provide you information about how to use medication. It's not someone that you may call and wish happy birthday to, but it's someone that you see regularly who becomes part of your daily lived experience. Participants in studies that I've done and projects that I've worked on have described these as such. George said, "I will socialize with people at those coffee houses. I will sit down and I will have conversations with people. It's very important for me to be able to talk to people. All I got to do is walk. As long as I can walk, I can go somewhere and talk to somebody." And then Pauline said, "I have an excellent group of car mechanics that I've been going to forever. They check the brakes, they rotate the tires, they ask me how my family is. They do a lot. I'm very fortunate to have them." I'm going to describe two separate studies today. The first is a project in collaboration with Cascadia Health that examines the housing, neighborhood, and community experience of residents of 16 supportive housing sites in Portland, Oregon. We asked them a variety of questions about their housing and their community activities. We talked with 172 residents of supportive housing. 90% were currently receiving mental health services. 56% were male, 68% white, 47% major affective disorder. Average age was 50, and 82% reported a history of homelessness. Okay, so the vast majority of participants had lived experience of homelessness. Among many other questions, we did ask them about these distal supports. We used a modified measure, a version of the distal support measure, where people were asked about interactions with community members at 5 community locations: grocery stores, pharmacies, restaurants or cafes, other types of stores, and other public places. And for one of these community locations to be identified as a distal support, participants had to provide 3 or more positive answers to the following 5 questions. Do people there recognize or acknowledge you when you come in? Do you feel welcomed there? Do you know the names of people there? Do they know your name? And do they sometimes help you out in times of need? So participants could have a maximum of 5 distal supports across those 5 different activity areas. Participants reported a mean number of 2.23 distal supports. There were 25 participants who reported no distal supports, so had no one at coffee shops or grocery stores or pharmacists that they felt any kind of sense of connection to, while 7 participants reported all 5 locations as being a distal support. One 110 participants identified a pharmacy as distal support, so that was the most reported area of distal support, followed by grocery stores, followed by other public places like libraries, churches, gyms, parks, and a community college, followed by restaurants or cafes, and then 38 participants reported other stores as being a distal support. These could be convenience stores, bookstores. And while pharmacies were the most frequently named distal support, grocery stores were the most frequently visited distal support. So people reported visiting grocery stores most often, where they saw someone who recognized them. They were able to say hi to someone. They might receive a favor from that individual. And examples of these, what we did, we coded the distal supports, the support they received at these distal supports according to kind of the three primary forms of social support. Tangible support, sometimes called material support, which is the provision of a favor, or think about it like the classic example of getting a cup of sugar or some eggs from a neighbor. That's a tangible support. Compared to emotional support, which was things like people listening to people's personal issues, providing emotional support, calling a participant after a surgical procedure. And then informational support, like directing participants to other health resources and calling to inform them about discounted items. The majority of participants reported receiving tangible support from distal support locations. So maybe being allowed to pay for some of their groceries later. Someone mentioned providing free baby clothes for a participant who was having a baby, offering to give a participant a ride home. These are the most common types of support, more so than emotional support or informational support. And it makes sense because it takes longer to develop a relationship with someone to where they're really providing more of the emotional care, the comforting of individuals. That may develop over time into a more long-term type of connection, but the distal supports are more of the day-to-day kind of favors or helpful information that people may provide. We found that there were no significant differences in distal supports between men and women, or between white participants and participants of color, or between participants with and without schizophrenia spectrum diagnoses, or by age. And so distal supports were broadly helpful for individuals, right? That all individuals benefited from distal supports. There weren't specific groups for whom these were more or less present, okay? And then we were also interested in what role that distal supports can play in predicting other outcomes over and above some of the demographic variables we looked at, and also over and above traditional social support. And so we measured people's sense of community, their sense of connection or belonging to the community. And we found that the number of distal supports that they had predicted their sense of community over and above traditional social support. So having friends, having family members, having a romantic partner, all of those were important for sense of community, but actually the distal supports were still able to predict unique variance in sense of community over and above that traditional support. There was something uniquely beneficial about more of those loose connections that people developed in the community. Similar for community participation. Friends and family networks were really important in connecting people with options and resources for participating broadly in their communities, but the distal supports played a beneficial role over and above those more traditional types of social support. It might be that they learn about how to engage in a new club or access a new resource in their community from someone at the grocery store or from a pharmacist, that those individuals were helping them get engaged in their communities over and above the more traditional roles of friends and family members. So the implication of that, it's really important in mental health services to not only ask questions about those more traditional types of support that we often ask about friends and family and romantic partners, but also to ask people, where are you going in the community? Do you talk to people there? How do they treat you? Do you enjoy going there? Do you recognize people there? It sometimes seems outside the scope of mental health or housing resources or housing services to ask those types of questions, but really working with people to develop those natural supports makes them have more access to more diverse types of social support, reduces the reliance or the overemphasis on support that is tied to the mental health center or the housing service, right? Gets them out in the community developing those natural supports that will help them in their recovery, help them in their integration into the community. And it's not only the individual's responsibility to identify those supports, it also informs the importance of communities making environments more conducive to fostering those distal supports, and the importance of addressing stigma and discrimination. People have been conducting really powerful research around enabling or accommodating environments. What physical and social features need to be in place in stores and services, in parks and recreation centers to make them accommodating to individuals with a variety of needs, right? And makes them places where people feel safe and supported and able to go. I'll now turn to some of my research examining the role of community participation in combating loneliness. And so we all participate in our communities in a variety of ways. We may go to work, we may go to a spiritual center, we may go to a shopping center, we may go to concerts, we may go to parks, gyms. We all participate and we all benefit in some ways from that participation. The World Health Organization has defined participation as a person's involvement in life situations, while others have defined it as the involvement of the person in activities that provide interactions with others in the community. And community participation has been found to be associated with better psychosocial and health outcomes, including increased quality of life, reduced loneliness, higher levels of physical activity, and also recovery from mental illness. However, too often for individuals experiencing homelessness and people with serious mental illnesses, most of the emphasis has been on basic activities of daily living or the domestic life, and less attention has been placed on measuring other aspects of community participation and its role in combating loneliness. Okay, so there's less of an emphasis on education opportunities, vocational opportunities, volunteer work, right? We tend to have people's communities be fairly constrained. So it's important to think broadly about the variety of ways that people may be participating in their communities and the supportive role that this can play in combating loneliness. So for the second study, this project was in collaboration with my partners at Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion. We did a national study where we interviewed individuals with serious mental illnesses and also individuals without serious mental illnesses about the activities they participate in. And you can see this map that people were recruited from across the country. We had 300 people with serious mental illnesses who were recruited from 21 community mental health centers in 15 states. Average age of 46, 61% female, 60% white, 57% reporting a diagnosed mood disorder, and 64% who had a lifetime history of homelessness. And we also recruited 300 adults in the general population who did not have a diagnosed mental illness from the Truven Health Analytics Pulse Survey, which is the largest health survey where people call individuals and ask certain questions about health behaviors. And you can also ask them certain questions related to research. So we were able to get a nationally representative sample of individuals through this service. The average age of our sample was 51, 55% were female, 79% white, 8% had lifetime histories of homelessness, so fewer than in the sample with people with serious mental illnesses. And interestingly, we found that 41% of participants with SMI were severely lonely based on their scores on the UCLA loneliness measure versus 7.3% of participants without an SMI, right? So staggering differences in loneliness based on whether or not individuals experienced a serious mental illness. We were interested in the role that participation may play in combating loneliness, and so we used the Temple University Community Participation Scale, which asks 22 different areas of participation across a wide variety of domains. And you ask people both how many days they participated in the community, and then also how many different areas that they're participating in those days. And we found that loneliness was significantly related to the total amount of community participation days, and also the number of different activity areas. So people who were participating more days of the month and participating in more areas of the community reported less loneliness. Further, we found that individuals with at least one participation day in certain participation areas had lower loneliness than those with no participation in these areas. And specifically, people going to a restaurant or cafe, going to a place of worship, going to a movie theater, going to a park or recreation center, going to a library, going to watch a sports event, taking a class for leisure or life skills, and hosting or visiting family or friends all reported less loneliness than those who were not doing those activities. We also found associations between loneliness and health. Participants who reported lower physical functioning, higher total number of physical health conditions, and greater bodily pain reported higher levels of loneliness. People with lower mental health functioning reported higher levels of loneliness. And a higher number of psychiatric hospitalizations in the last 6 months was associated with greater loneliness. We also found that housing was related to loneliness. Housing satisfaction was found to be a significant predictor of loneliness, and those who were unsatisfied with their housing had higher levels of loneliness. Housing tenure was also important, with loneliness being higher among people who had just moved into their residence and lower the longer they lived in the residence, okay? So this is encouraging and speaks to the role of housing stability and working with people to make sure that they can remain in housing, because we show that while they may be lonely when they first enter into housing, the longer they're there, the longer they're able to form connections either with roommates or neighbors or other people in the community, the less loneliness they report. So findings of the study emphasize the need to actively encourage community participation as a possible means of reducing loneliness. So again, in mental health and housing services, we often don't ask people as many questions about what they're doing in the community, but this shows that it's really important to help people form activity plans and ways that they will be engaging more broadly in their community, and that this can help to reduce loneliness they may experience. Findings also inform policies, programs, and clinical practices that remove barriers to participation and support active engagement in communities to help combat loneliness, okay? So the importance of having environments that are conducive to people participating, whether it's through physical things like ramps for people who need it, or social things like having people trained in mental health first aid, or having people trained in how to engage with people who are experiencing homelessness in a way that is affirming and not stigmatizing, right? Those are all important ways to help support people as they engage broadly in their community. Just a couple other areas that I think are highly relevant to today's topic that I wanted to discuss are in terms of relationships tied to housing. People may be in a variety of housing settings. Supportive housing can look different in different ways. Sometimes it's scatter site, where they may have a voucher to rent on the fair market like anyone else, and they may have a unit by themselves, or it could be a congregate living facility where everyone there has experienced homelessness, or everyone there is using a certain type of service. And there are pros and cons to those models. One, in the studies that we've done that involve more of the congregate living environment, we've asked people about their neighbors, and supportive housing embeds residents in everyday social spaces and encourages organic connections with others like their neighbors. And we want to encourage people to get out of the apartment complex and also develop relationships in the broader community. But those neighbors within the facility can help to offer a supportive space where people are living or have the same lived experience, and it can be a safer environment to start kind of that socializing, the social support, and then use that to then develop relationships outside in the broader community. Neighbor support can play a crucial role in reducing isolation, enhancing social integration, and creating pathways toward recovery for individuals with serious mental illnesses and histories of homelessness. And research I've done has shown that neighbor relationships have been found to be associated with lower levels of loneliness, higher levels of sense of community among adults with serious mental health challenges, regardless of the number of neighbors they report feeling close to. So if they are satisfied with the relationships, the quality of them, that is beneficial over and above the number. And so it's important to work with people to identify what types of neighbors are most supportive and find ways to help develop positive relationships with their neighbors. And then finally, the role of staff and housing providers and peer providers. Supportive housing staff support has been found to be associated with lower levels of loneliness among supportive housing residents. So it's really important for housing staff to be checking up on individuals, to be working with individuals, to make sure that they're supported in housing, that they can remain stably housed. Formerly homeless individuals in supportive housing have discussed the importance of staff in creating community within housing sites and connecting residents to community resources. They may have open houses or barbecues or parties where they invite neighbors and then people can meet one another. Those can be important ways to facilitate connection. And then peer facilitated approaches are really important. So these can help build community within housing sites and also connect people to community resources. And many of these are being piloted. They're sometimes called peer bridgers, or in Portland, we have a building community with peer providers, BCPP model. And in our studies, we've asked people what type of support these people can play for them, and they'll say things like, if you need to talk to someone about trivial or serious stuff, you don't need to make an appointment with a counselor. Just head right downstairs, ask for advice. It's one of the best things that has happened around. And these are peer providers that are connected to the housing, that are there to provide support, to listen, to help provide a connection to resources, answer questions about how to use the stove or how to go grocery shopping. And these can be a really important way to both connect people to services, but also to help reduce loneliness within housing. So with that, I'll end my time and turn things, I think, back over to Dr. Tsai to introduce our next speaker. Thanks.
Dr. Townley, thanks for that presentation and that really interesting set of studies that you shared, along with discussing the implications. I think it sets the stage for the topic. So our second speaker is our speaker from Sydney, Dr. Marlee Bauer. Dr. Bauer is a researcher at the Matilda Center at the University of Sydney. She has studied broad social determinants of mental health, particularly on understanding loneliness and isolation among marginalized individuals, and also examining how this relates to the built environment. She's currently working on the impact of the climate on mental health and the role that housing and neighborhood design can play to protect the health of those most at risk. Dr. Bauer, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jack. And yeah, so I'm Marlee, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use from the University of Sydney. And today I'm going to talk about work I did during my PhD, which was at Western Sydney University and funded by Australian Rotary Health. I also wanted to acknowledge the Haymarket Foundation, which is a large and incredible homelessness service in Sydney, for whom I'm lucky to be a board member of the last 5 years and hopefully another 5 years and into the future. It's an amazing place, so look it up if you have a chance. I'm now expanding my work, as Jack said, into the climate change space, which is trying to understand the way that climate change interacts with our housing and homelessness and the experience of marginalization to impact people's mental and social health. So if you're interested in that space, and feel free to get in touch afterwards. I'd love to talk more about it. Just change the slide and figure out how. Yeah, okay. So my PhD, I started to become really, I think, hopefully my topic area will become will be a natural extension of Greg's talk. I feel like it will cover a lot of the same ground, but hopefully consolidate that knowledge. I became really interested in this area after working on different Housing First and health program evaluations of people experiencing homelessness, and finding that loneliness was this current thread that went through people's stories and lives. And it was described as quite often as like, the least of people's problems. Like, well, of course they're lonely, but that's not the problem. They're homeless. But in fact, it seemed that that was actually the kernel of many of the issues that was happening. So I wanted to kind of explore this better and understand what loneliness was for people who had a lived experience of homelessness, and what made people more likely to experience this loneliness. So I'm going to argue over my talk that loneliness can be considered within treatment and housing services, or should be considered, and failing to do so can put a real spanner, or I know you call it a wrench, in the works. And a note on that, I know there might be a few Australianisms that I point to during my presentation, but if there is anything that is unclear, just let me know and I'll try and clarify. So why is it important to study this area? So as Greg mentioned, loneliness is a major public health concern associated with a host of physical and mental health disorders. So in fact, the mortality rate associated with loneliness is on par with smoking and alcoholism. People experiencing homelessness are particularly susceptible to loneliness. They have high rates of mental disorder, relationship breakdown, often have histories of trauma, and experience multiple levels of discrimination. Loneliness may also be particularly dangerous for people experiencing homelessness. One study noted that loneliness is one of the primary reasons a formerly homeless person may leave a tenancy and return to homelessness, to old friends and habits on the street. Research also suggests that loneliness makes people less likely to seek help or treatment for existing mental health issues, which is a major issue in a population that we know has so much or high rates of mental disorder. Despite all this, when I started my research in this in 2014, there wasn't that much that had been done on this topic, so it felt quite important. So first up, I wanted to know how people with a lived experience of homelessness understand and experience loneliness. I used two main conceptual frameworks to understand the question. Firstly, social identity theory, which recognizes that a person's self-concept is deeply rooted in the social group that they feel they belong to or don't belong to. People are naturally motivated to adopt a positive and valuable social identity and will behave in ways that goes to achieve this. And because this population is so diverse, I also applied an intersectional framework, recognizing that participants' experience of loneliness likely differs according to the unique constellation of identities they inhabit, such as their homelessness or whether they identify as LGBT or First Nations, and the differing and multiple levels of stigma and discrimination associated with each of these identities and experiences. So I first conducted some qualitative interviews with participants to understand this experience. And I tried to make the sample diverse to reflect all the different types of experiences people could have. So they ranged in gender, so male, female, transgender, and intersex. And I apologize for the very gendered color scheme, but sometimes it's easier for communication. And also who ranged in type of homelessness, so whether they're in kind of crisis accommodation, couch surfing, rough sleeping, in boarding or rooming houses, I think you call them, and the formerly homeless and now housed, and also who ranged in their experience, so whether they've been incarcerated, their class and occupational background. Two were both Aboriginal First Nations and transgender, and one had an intellectual disability, etc. So how was loneliness experienced? Well, my findings found that loneliness was experienced in two ways, both as marginalization and stigma associated with homelessness and other identities that people held, and also as inadequate social networks. And these two themes were inseparable. They overlapped and they informed each other, as you'll see further as I go along. So participants often described rejection and disconnection from those who they deemed most critical and important in their social network, which was often their family members. Some described this happening prior to homelessness or even precipitating it in the first place. So after being kicked out of the family home due to family violence, Miley described homelessness as feeling that no one wants you in the world anymore. Your parents don't want you and you just feel alone. Others experience rejection from family connections after homelessness. So for example, Peter said, of his own sister, don't call us, we won't call you. My own sister, Participants experienced homelessness as a rejection from society felt acutely through their perceived visibility to others. Sarah, as many others did, described this really eloquently, as she was feeling simultaneously extremely visible, but also really invisible to the rest of society in a way that it hurt, almost physically. I've tried to draw on the Gailey's theory of hyperinvisibility to understand this, which is a theory informed by her work on the experiences of self-described fat women. Gailey describes the visual tightrope that these women traverse, being at once really socially visible, as they're often publicly scrutinized and judged, and invisible because they're often erased and stigmatized. She labels this phenomena hyperinvisibility, which occurs when a person is sometimes paid exceptional attention and critical judgment, and is sometimes exceptionally overlooked. And this can happen simultaneously. She argues that someone's situation becomes hyper when their invisibility becomes socially oppressive, constraining their ability to participate in a socially meaningful way. So participants describe trying to wrestle with this and create a positive visibility to others in order to influence their loneliness. So, for instance, Susan described there being a need for more public faces of homelessness, saying things won't change until the white middle class are represented and involved in homelessness groups, saying there needs to be more faces to homelessness. Until there's representation of white middle class people, nothing's going to change. Sarah described that her loneliness would not exist if she had a connection with someone at a compassionate level who sees her and makes her feel visible in a way that doesn't feel ugly. The stigma that participants received from the outside world often led to poor and shame-fueled views about themselves, which led to some to actively marginalize themselves from those that they really cared about. So some described isolating themselves from other homeless people and the general public. For example, Sarah described choosing not to impose herself on the non-homeless, as the presence of a homeless person made people uncomfortable. And part of loving people is accepting that they're not comfortable with you and they don't want you. Trevor described avoiding his friends from prior to homelessness because of the shame around admitting he was now homeless and his fear of the negative meanings around that. You know, that he said, I just had no conversation to have with them. They may have wondered why I was homeless and what that would mean. The shame and stigma around homelessness also influenced how they perceived themselves and thus the stigma they experienced as warranted. This stigma affected how they assessed the social world they did have. So many participants I spoke to had these really kind of, as Greg mentioned, active networks. You know, they would be getting text after text on their phone when I was speaking to them of many different kinds of people. And I said, oh, so what's your social life like? And people often said, oh, a social life, I don't have one of those. That's for people that aren't homeless. And so, I mean, that really surprised me. But it also kind of aligned with how people talked about their things like employment or unemployment. So Sahara said, you know, when you're unemployed, you're still the same person, but you've lost that feeling that you're worth something. Peter's account also internalizes stigma around homelessness, saying, you know, you're typecast, it's natural, and no wonder people don't want you around. But while participants had constraints on the relationships they could make due to their marginalization and rejection from different aspects of society, they did have power over how they related to others within homeless networks, and this allowed them to control their identity in a way that made them feel valuable and positive. So Susan, who came from an upper middle class background, described managing a valuable social identity by choosing not to associate too much with other homeless people, describing them as people she wouldn't normally even have looked at. Whereas participants like Craig, who had this background of social disadvantage and incarceration, emphasized the realness of the homeless population, describing their interactions as more authentic than with the non-homeless. You know, at least what they say is what they say. They're real people at the homelessness service. However, not all participants had the capacity to do this. Sarah described being at the bottom of the pecking order due to her learning disability and low social support. Others formed other networks which bolstered their social identity based on their values and needs. And this is kind of similar to the Distal networks that Greg talked about. So Athena made friends with service providers outside of the homeless community, saying when she spends time with these caseworkers, they really care. You know, when you're with them, you feel like a proper person, you feel a bit better about yourself. Sahara made friends at the local lawn bowls club where everyone knows everybody and knows what everybody does. And even Sarah, who was rejected by other homeless people and was asked to leave her local church, which is the big church in the city here, at various times of the year when dignitaries come to visit, like Easter and Christmas. She described making her own alternate mass at a rose garden, which she described as her little sacred spot where she can go to God when there's times when people make her leave and she can't stay. Sadly, the visibility and rejection also appeared to extend, at least for some, beyond homelessness. So Walker described still feeling marginalized and judged due to how he presented when spending time at his inner city locale, saying, you know, just because you don't have a fancy suit or you don't have a lot of money, there'll be snobs to you. And most that I spoke to had retained homeless friendships due to the lack of acceptance they had in their mainstream society. Sometimes these relationships were adequate to meet their needs and sometimes they weren't. So for instance, Walker said he likes it there. No one judges you. No one tells you you're a loser. Whereas Peter said he doesn't want to interact. He feels like it might rub off. I know I'm just not where I should be socially, you know. So we can see that this idea of loneliness was not straightforward. It was a complex and diverse process, and the negotiation of three different factors, so the preservation of a valued social identity, missing critical relationships, and the material and institutional context of homelessness. And I didn't even get to discuss the role of substance use in this equation, which I can also share with anyone that's interested after the presentation. But I do argue that any health intervention would need to look at these three components and envelope within this broader context of marginalisation to really make inroads. So just quickly now onto some quantitative study I did on who is likely to be lonely and why. So to do this, I, like the qual sample, I tried to make it diverse, and 129 participants may seem kind of small in the kind of broad studies that we tend to do, but just acknowledging that because of the really sensitive nature of the topic area, I really had to spend time with different people, gain trust and acceptance before interviewing them around this topic. And some of these interviews and surveys were quite long, or they ended up being long because of that, sometimes many hours. And so it was kind of an in-depth process, but a really enjoyable one. And people range in their experiences, life experiences, and the type of homelessness they experienced. So I also want to acknowledge that participants' qual accounts supported a multidimensional conceptualization of loneliness, so differing by the network group it was associated with. So whether it be family, friends, or intimate partners. And so I used the SAMHSA to measure loneliness, which allowed me to measure these differences. So I found that not all participants were equally likely to experience loneliness. So those who'd been in prison over their lifetime tended to experience lower levels of loneliness, social loneliness on average, compared to those who had not been in prison. Those who identified as female tended to experience less social loneliness on average compared to those who identified as male. Those with problematic alcohol use tended to experience higher social loneliness scores compared to those without this use. And both female and non-cisgender participants tended to experience high levels of romantic loneliness compared to male loneliness. So unexpectedly, the study revealed that greater social support often correlated with increased loneliness amongst participants, contrary to the common belief or understanding that more support reduces loneliness. So I found that affectionate support led to increased romantic loneliness. Positive social interaction support led to higher social loneliness, and informational support led to greater family loneliness. These findings do make sense when we think about prior qualitative insights, suggesting that participants' relationships were often low quality and driven by mutual need for safety rather than that sense of need for intimacy or personal value. Some findings I have were more straightforward. So participants who placed greater importance on a specific network group, like their family or friends, experience more loneliness associated with that group. And this aligns with loneliness theory, which suggests that valuing a network more increases the likelihood you'd feel lonely if the relationship with that group was not going well or meeting your expectations. Loneliness theory also would suggest, though, that greater satisfaction with a network reduces loneliness, but my findings showed the opposite. So, for example, being more satisfied with your family relationships predicted greater family loneliness. This, however, does make sense when we think about the complex dynamics that people who've experienced homelessness often have with their families. Similarly, participants who are more satisfied with their intimate partner relationships reported higher romantic loneliness. And this might reflect how participants in the context of homelessness evaluated partner satisfaction based on immediate survival needs rather than emotional needs that mitigate loneliness. Interestingly, some participants described satisfaction with being single, and this is possibly due to past experiences of rejection, abuse, and violence. And for them, being alone was seen as a form of self-care and resilience, highlighting how satisfaction with being single can coexist with limited social connections. Also contrary to my expectations was that participants' rated level of satisfaction with their current and pre-homeless friend network groups was not linked to social loneliness. This didn't make sense to me when us considering that the importance of these groups was associated with it. And it suggests that participants may have assessed the satisfaction with their friendships based not on social or intimacy-based factors, but on their ability to provide support and resources. And I also tested whether current connections, such as pets or service providers, could compensate for the absence of valued relationships and even reduce loneliness. So initially, having a pet or access to service providers was linked to reduced social loneliness, while friendships that were often family-like was linked to reduced family loneliness. However, when I included these alongside traditional family and friend relationship variables, these substitutes did not compensate for the absence of original relationships in mitigating these types of loneliness. And finally, despite being cross-sectional, I was interested to see how these experiences differed between those who are currently and no longer homeless. And unfortunately, I found there was limited evidence of improvement after exiting homelessness. So social and romantic loneliness was pretty much unchanged, and family loneliness worsened. This has occurred despite the formerly homeless reporting more frequent contact and closer relationships with family, highlighting the challenges of reconnection and suggesting that family dynamics can be complex and support is crucial to help people through this transition. So obtaining housing did not appear to integrate individuals into the community or provide particularly fulfilling romantic relationships, a trend often noted in housing first evaluations. And others have found that the fear of losing support from homeless friends and feelings of survivor guilt can lead people to return to homelessness. So in conclusion, I want to argue that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to fixing loneliness amongst this group. Relationships formed during homelessness are beneficial for survival, but can maintain and marginalize people long term. A person's loneliness can be addressed only through meaningful relationships with the person or group they value, and substitute relationships will not compensate. So rather than just tenancy support or case management, social identity might be an important framework for understanding community integration and recovery after homelessness. We need to ask people how they want to live, how they understand themselves within the network of relationships that they have, and identities and experiences that matter to them. So this might not feel like rocket science, probably because it's not, but it's a large departure for what happens on the ground in Australia in housing and public housing. And so it's a change that we need to have, and it sounds like it might be similar in America. But get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Power, for those interesting findings and some counterintuitive findings as well. And I'm sure people have questions. I encourage you to just continue to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them in the Q&A. And I think also a lot of the findings you report, they may not be limited to just one country. They may apply to folks, across various countries. Okay, so our third speaker, Dr. Michael Rowe. Dr. Rowe is Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. He's also a professor at Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. He has written and conducted funded research on homelessness and mental health outreach, patient-doctor relationships, and peer-informed interventions for people with mental illness for over 2 decades. I've had the privilege of collaborating with Dr. Rowe on research projects before, and really appreciate his impactful work on citizenship, which he's going to present on today. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Dr. Sai. Alicia, can I minimize? Yeah. Looks like I got rid of myself too.
We can see you.
Oh, okay. I can't see me. I'm going to actually skip my last couple of slides because they're not central to my message today, and I will leave a little bit more time for questions and discussion. And my presentation is not directly about loneliness, but there's loneliness in it. And to be without full citizenship is a lonely place to be. In 1994, I was the director of a mental health outreach team in New Haven, Connecticut, as part of a SAMHSA national research demonstration project called Access, aimed at addressing homelessness among people with psychiatric disabilities. That winter, 2 outreach workers, Nancy and Joe, went to the main branch of the public library in New Haven to look for a pair of neon yellow sneakers. This was all they'd been able to see on their outreach run a few days earlier, sticking out from one end of a half-dozen blankets on the ledge of a highway bridge for Interstate 95. It was 5:30 in the morning, and they didn't want to wake this person, so they came back later. But the ledge was start my video.
Now we've got you back.
Okay. Yeah, they didn't want to wake this person, so they came back later, but the ledge was empty. They started asking around about a person who wore neon yellow sneakers. Finally, someone said, "Oh, that's Jim. Try the public library." People who were homeless were allowed to sleep at the library with a book propped up in front of them. So Joe and Nancy walked around their reading room, ducking down to look at shoes and standing up as though they were bobbing for apples. And finally, they found a pair of neon yellow sneakers in Jim. Jim grew up in a rural area near Pittsburgh in a poor family that he was banished from at age 17 because of his inappropriate interest in a younger female cousin. He joined the Army, got an honorable discharge, and roamed the eastern seaboard of the US, taking menial jobs and losing them due to his drinking and odd behavior. And at some point, he was diagnosed with a serious mental illness and alcoholism. And finally, he came to New Haven, homeless. Having found him at the library, Nancy and Joe met with Jim, who told them in no uncertain terms that he did not want or deserve their help. But Ron, a peer outreach worker, connected with Jim. He told me he'd learned 2 things about him. One was, don't try to talk to Jim before he eats. He'll just be grouchy. The other was that people were always asking Jim for things. Got $1, Jim? Got a cigarette, Jim? So Ron always brought things for him. A sandwich, a pair of socks, a cup of coffee. Over the course of about a year, with Ron's encouragement, Jim applied for and was awarded SSI, got reconnected to VA services, and met with our team psychiatrist. Finally, after months of saying no way, no how, never to Ron about housing, Jim went apartment hunting with Ron, found a place, and moved in. We were happy for Jim, happy for Ron, and happy for the team. If we could get Jim housed, we could do anything. 2 weeks later, Ron came into a team meeting and said Jim had decided to go back to living on the streets. There he had friends. In his apartment building, he was lonely. On the streets, he was a guy who could survive homelessness. In his apartment building, people avoided him. Ron's announcement was a shock for me. I realized that we could leave our offices and look for people who didn't want to be found. We could build strong relationships with them, person to person. We could offer them a wide range of services, including housing and a slot as clients in the local mental health system of care. What we couldn't offer them was the chance to become neighbors in their neighborhoods, members of the larger community of New Haven, and full citizens in our democratic society. All right, we had an idea about citizenship. Now we needed a definition. Here's what we came up with. Citizenship is a person's or people's strong connection to the 5 R's of rights, responsibilities, roles, resources, and relationships that society offers its members. I'll say that again. Citizenship is a person's or people's strong connection to the 5 R's of rights, responsibilities, roles, resources, and relationships that society offers its members. The 5 R's of citizenship also support a sense of belonging in society that's validated by others. And with validated belonging comes recognition as an equal. Now let's go through each of the 5 R's. Rights are civil, legal, political, social, and rights are the first R. You can't be a practicing or even a passive citizen without them. Citizenship responsibilities include paying taxes, obeying laws, serving on juries, but there's more. A student in the Citizens Project, which is coming up shortly, told me that he had the right to have responsibilities. That is, he had the right to do, not only to be done for by others. Valued roles are valued by the person and by society. Parent, teacher, mentor, student, employee, and a job that pays a living wage, all are valued roles. Resources are tangible possessions, a home, car, money. They're also our strengths and gifts and our access to social and cultural opportunities. Relationships are those of friendship, love, caregiving, a parent and child, and more. All right. Excuse me. We had an idea about citizenship. Now we had a definition of citizenship, and now we had to do something with it. It turned out that a colleague, Dr. Madeline Baranowski at the Connecticut Mental Health Center in New Haven, was confronting a similar problem in her work running a jail diversion program to the one that we had confronted with outreach work. Dr. Baranowski could help people with psychiatric disabilities who ran afoul of the law to get out of the criminal justice system and into the mental health system. For example, Jenny was homeless with mental health problems. She passed by a private residence one evening and saw a garbage can full of redeemable bottles and cans that were going out with the trash. So she went onto the property, loaded up a plastic bag she carried with her. The owner called the police and she was arrested for trespass on private property. Dr. Baranowski, with Jenny's permission, got the charges dropped in exchange for Jenny's enrolling in mental health treatment, thus moving her from one system, criminal justice, to another, mental health, but she couldn't help Jenny become a full member of her community and society. And the irony is that Jenny's crime involved working for a living and recycling, activities we associate with being a good community member and citizen. Dr. Baranowski had some funding for special projects, so a group of us, researchers, peers, providers, advocates, met for weeks to figure out what a citizenship intervention might look like. We came up with 3 parts for what we named the Citizens Project. A 4th part was developed by students later on. First would be classes built around the 5 R's. Class sessions might include people's rights and responsibilities in relation to the criminal justice and mental health systems. Classes on resources such as housing might be taught by a local realtor and so on. Second would be valued role projects that challenge students' low estimation of themselves and taught community members that people with psychiatric disabilities can contribute to society. One cohort taught a group of police officers in training what it was like to be homeless on the streets and be approached by a couple of big police officers. It was a good training, practically speaking, and symbolically as well, with the rejects of society teaching the protectors of society. The 3rd part of the Citizens Project would be group and individual peer support based on our research showing that peers had a special capacity to engage with people who refused services. And the 4th part was What's Up? What's Up gives students a chance to talk about what's happening in their lives, not just what's happening with their mental illness or substance use issues or criminal charges. A different student leads each session. Everyone speaks and gets feedback from their fellow students. What's Up is a venue for students to explore their relationships with others and their relationship between themselves and their communities. We conducted a randomized clinical trial that compared people receiving the Citizens Project plus clinical treatment to people receiving clinical treatment alone. We found that the mental health treatment, Citizens Projects had statistically reduced drug and alcohol use compared to the mental health treatment alone group, and that the citizenship group's drug and alcohol use decreased over time while the comparison group's use increased. Citizens Project students' quality of life also increased compared to the control group. And we learned that the Citizens Project is not just a group to prepare people for the next step in achieving citizenship, but it's a mini community itself. One student said, Citizens Project is like a harbor, like a shining piece from the sea for all those lost souls. It helped me regain a piece of the man I thought I lost. It brought back my confidence, my hunger for life. I didn't know I'd make friends we'd consider family. I learned there are people who are willing to fight for you when you throw in the towel. All right, we had an idea that we called citizenship, and then we defined citizenship, and then we created a program to help people move toward attaining citizenship. But there was this nagging question. How would the people whose citizenship we were trying to support define citizenship? Would they say that citizenship was just legal citizenship, as some skeptical clinicians and administrators had said when we were starting out? We needed to know what the people we were working with thought. We needed to go to the source. NIMH funded us to do that. Our team included faculty, researchers, peer mentors, and other staff from the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health, also known as PERCH. We held focus groups of people receiving public mental health services. We offered the beginning of a sentence. To me, being a citizen means, and we asked people to complete the sentence, and they did. They said, to me, being a citizen means being included. To me, being a citizen means giving back to others, and much more. After eliminating identical or nearly identical statements, we ended up with 100 items, and we invited people receiving mental health services to complete individual exercises. First, we asked them to rank the 100 citizenship statements on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 on how important each statement was to their idea of citizenship. Then we had them go through the list again and rank each statement based on how much they felt they possessed that statement in their lives. So if I'm going through the 100 statements the first time and I come across citizenship means feeling safe in my neighborhood, and I think that's really vital for citizenship, I give it a 5. But if I'm going through the second time and citizenship feeling safe in my neighborhood, and I feel like I don't feel safe in my neighborhood at all, I give it a 1. Our analysis of the results led to development of a 46-item instrument with primary domains of citizenship that mapped on well to the 5 R's in belonging. So now we knew that people we were working with had wide-ranging aspirational ideas about citizenship, well beyond the important but narrow legal aspect of citizenship. All right, we had an idea about citizenship and a definition of citizenship and a successful intervention in the Citizens Project and an individual measure of citizenship. But what happens after the Citizens Project, which lasts only 6 months? Is that it? And then you're fine? Well, a community organizer with PERCH was facilitating conversations with members of a social rehab club who wanted to become more involved in the New Haven community and work for social change. The group quickly shifted to meeting at a coffee shop in town to eliminate mental health oversight and named themselves FACE for Focus, Act, Connect Every Day. FACE practices collective citizenship for causes that members agree on. In FACE, the process of arriving at decisions collectively and of undertaking activities are equally important. Activities have included creating murals with children and adults at neighborhood festivals, speaking at a public meeting with the federal legislator on food security policy, and joining an anti-hunger coalition. FACE's contribution to the field of community mental health is that of pointing to a shift from the individual with mental distress as a consumer citizen to the individual's involvement in collective efforts and causes. All right, we had an idea called citizenship. Then we defined citizenship. And then we developed an intervention to help put people on the road to citizenship. Then we supported an ongoing group that advocated for others at and beyond the borders of the mental health system. But what about clinicians? What did they think of citizenship for their clients? We asked them. We met with each of the clinical teams at the Connecticut Mental Health Center in New Haven, had them look at a 12-item brief version of the measure, and then had a group discussion with them about it. We learned that clinicians were skeptical about their capacity to adopt a new practice when they had to spend so much of their time keeping their clients safe and alive. One said, the biggest challenge of all is all the issues we're helping people with before you can even think about citizenship. Housing and food and shelter and psychiatric crises and medical issues. Where are they going to sleep tonight? Will they have food at the end of the month? Clinicians also talked about having to focus on risk assessment in their work with clients. One said, there are plenty of people without mental illness who make terrible decisions and destroy their lives, but somehow when you're in this system, it becomes different. So, a challenging reality for bringing citizenship into clinical care. But there's another side to clinicians and citizenship. We conducted a study of citizenship acts among clinicians, which involved asking them if they ever bent the rules and norms of clinical work to support their clients. One clinician talked about taking more time when she met with her clients and less of it talking about medications because it was the right thing to do. Another said it was important to have lunch with clients. Another spoke of using natural, descriptive, non-medicalized language and rounds when she spoke about her clients. Citizenship acts, as Dr. Helen Hamer wrote, can support a holistic understanding of the person and a shift to subversive humanitarianism with clinicians, case managers, and others making claims for justice for the people they serve. And I think I'll end it there. I do want to thank all of the many dozens of citizenship researchers, peers, and others who have worked on this citizenship work and research over the past 25 years or so. I want to acknowledge the support of the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, which has funded a good deal of this work. Also note that I do not represent the views of the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Dr. Rowe. Yeah, that was great. Thanks for sharing all that information with us and all your work. Okay, so we have about 13 minutes for Q&A, and I see there's been really good interaction between our audience and some of our speakers responding to the chats. But our speakers can turn their cameras on because I'm just going to throw out some questions that some of the audience members had sent ahead of time. I think none of the speakers have touched on them. So let's start with this question about any suggestions for how to combat isolation and loneliness in rural areas where access to technology and transportation are lacking. Any of the speakers want to comment on that?
It's Michael. I could just say I've done a little bit of work in Norway, and homeless outreach work in Norway is very different than I certainly would know it in municipal areas in the U.S. And one of the ways that they, I mean, you've got to travel long distances, but you also have to develop relationships with other providers and with community agencies in these rural areas. So I think work with rural governments, centers, churches, other groups that you can connect with is one way to think about of that approach.
Can I step in and say we've done some interesting work looking at kind of video technology with people experiencing homelessness, and obviously it's from the Australian context, so I can't speak to the US context, but you know, most people had smartphones and were pretty comfortable using them. But what was the barrier was that people really needed to have an existing relationship with the people they were video contacting. So, you know, you can kind of bridge major geographical divides through that, but you need to have that kind of in-person support first. So maybe it's about providing services that can help with that initial contact to people who have the kind of level of trust and rapport that can be maintained over video contact. But also another thing, a step back, is that in Australia, often the way we house people experiencing homelessness is with a real scarcity mindset. Like, you know, you'll take what you're given, no matter where it is in the country, no matter where your connections are, where your values are. So if someone has chosen to live in the rural area, you'd hope it would be because they have some existing kind of connections there, or a set of values that connect with that area. If it is because that's where there is housing, you know, that's kind of not, it's not where we want our housing policy to be from a homelessness perspective. So I suppose turning it around and saying, are people housed there because they want to be or because they have to be? Yeah.
Those are both really good suggestions, and I think it is challenging. We've found that people's reported sense of community and their reported ability to participate in their communities in rural areas is far lower than people in urban settings. And often we found that people feel kind of the strongest sense of connection. One of the questions in the chat was around like going to the community can sometimes feel isolating and make people feel more different. And that can be especially troubling in rural areas where there are fewer people, and so you stand out more. Whereas in urban settings, you can kind of blend in, you can find more people that are similar to you. So I think both around like where to site supportive housing locations, like Dr. Bauer was saying, is really important. But then also finding ways to get people, if they so wish, out of the rural environments into urban settings, even if temporarily. And so there could be some peer facilitated models where people are paid to be drivers of individuals, so picking them up, taking them somewhere to more of an urban location. Also car programs where people can donate vehicles to people experiencing homelessness, so that they can have access to being able to get out of those communities and access resources elsewhere. But in telehealth technology, things like that have also been helpful in some of the work I've done.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. We have an interesting question about after living outside or in a communal setting, what suggestions do you have for coping with unsettling quietness? I think this question is kind of asking, when is it okay to be, sometimes some people need to learn how to be comfortable with silence and being alone. So when is that healthy and when is it unhealthy? Especially if somebody's living outside, used to living outside around others or in a communal setting.
I think the piece around supporting people as they come into housing is one of the pieces that I think we still need a lot of work in. We always hear anecdotally that people have this isolation that occurs when they come inside, or people actually are shown to like there's weight gain that can occur because all of a sudden people have access to food, and so then they may have some other physical health issues that come about. But then this idea around like the environment, it feels foreign, right? You hear people sometimes talk about like not wanting to sleep on a bed, sleeping on a floor, but because it feels more familiar. And I think the noise part of that is a big feature in that when people are living on streets and urban settings, there's constantly stimuli that may be lacking inside. And so working with people perhaps on how to like modify the environment to put in, buy a stereo, buy a record player, buy a TV, and work with them to know around volume so that they don't, disturb their neighbors. But I think some of those things can be fairly easily done, and there are grant programs that people can access for purchasing things like a turntable or a stereo for their units to help with that, with the noise piece. I think also having like community events on site so that people have a reason to get out of their unit. And again, hopefully that on-site activities provide pathways and bridges into the community, but certainly starting there is important. But again, I think this is one of those like pieces that we haven't fully understood because it's so individualized by person and by context.
I agree with Greg, and I think that a lot there has been in Australia some really interesting work done with occupational therapists in supporting people in that kind of graded exposure to the new environment and finding really logical and practical steps to do things like stereo for noise, what it means to sleep in a bed, what it means to close your door, that kind of thing. But those programs have always been pilots, and we had that phenomenon, which I'm sure you did too. So many pilots, but no plane to fly. There's never that kind of continuation of these programs that mean people can have long-term impacts. I also wonder, with the quietness, I mean, people experiencing long-term homelessness have said to me in the past, if I go into housing, I'm worried that I'll die and no one will find me. That sense of total absence of support or noise or passers-by. And I know that does happen regularly. So I wonder if it's not so much also about the noise, but the fear. And so kind of finding ways to deal with those emotions as well, where the risk might be real, not just imagined.
Great. Well, those are helpful thoughts for people to think about. A question we got is, what are the role that pets may have, and are they good emotional resources in terms of loneliness?
I have a colleague, Catherine Stein, who published a paper in, I think, like mid to late 2000s. The title was "Who Let the Dogs In?" which, play on the song "Who Let Dogs Out." And so it was looking at pets within supportive housing environments and finding that people who were provided with pets had a stronger sense of connectedness, responsibility, emotional stability. I think pets can also act as a bridge, right? When you're walking and you see someone else with a dog, it facilitates a natural conversation. Even if it's about the dogs, it's still a conversation they may not have otherwise had. And so I think these are wonderful ideas. It also speaks again to that piece of being responsive to people's needs for housing when they're coming out of homelessness. If they've had an animal that has helped them survive on the street, and they all of a sudden are told they can't bring that animal into a shelter space or a housing space, that's a huge source of connection and a combator of loneliness that they now have to be without. And so I think that having more provisions of housing sites that allow for animals, where people can work to understand like what they need to do to make sure that they can be in housing, and that if there are concerns around what the animal will do with that those are mitigated. But yes, absolutely. Research shows that pets are important, and then people just anecdotally, I mean, just the support they provide, and having something, again, that reciprocity, having someone that you're responsible for, that loves you, you love them back, I think can be really key.
I think lots of people who've worked with homelessness know immediately what pets mean to lots of folks who are homeless. And you've heard people not connected with the homeless, seeing someone who's homeless with an animal, and hearing that they spent their last dollar taking their pet to the vet, and how crazy that is. But how crazy is it? I mean, really, if you're a pet lover yourself, what pets can do, and how they can fill an empty space, and are great companions. So I think we just need to think about how can we help people who have pets keep their pets, and for those that it might be helpful to, how can they have them in a way that would conform to whatever the rules are of where they're living, and maybe stretch those rules.
Yeah, that's great. We have a question about what populations are most likely to experience loneliness. How does this intersect with race and identity? So are there cultural considerations here around loneliness?
I can only speak to the Australian example, but definitely it felt like, it was evident in the evidence that I had, that people who had multiple forms of discrimination experienced more complex kind of envisions of loneliness, because they not only had that stigma associated with homelessness, but also what it meant to be First Nations, Aboriginal, what it meant to be LGBT, what it meant to be trans, and it made things a lot more complicated, particularly if they didn't fit into the box of what someone came to expect as a homeless person, often an older male with a drinking problem. That's, a very different stereotype. So I think it is definitely a different experience, and one that we need to I suppose, create more awareness of the complexity of homelessness as a phenomena and how that's going to impact people's lived experience and their daily lives of homelessness.
I think that's beautifully stated and mirrors what we see in the United States as well. And I'll just add one more area of intersectionality that we're seeing is around aging, that as people age, anyone's social network becomes smaller because of death or other reasons. And so if you add on that the experience of homelessness, it makes it even more challenging for people to form networks. And we're both seeing, a phenomenon of a rapidly aging homeless population, but also one in which loneliness can be even harder than people who are younger. And then adding in the intersectional marginalities related to race, gender, sexual orientation, and just people's ability to find someone that looks like them. Like shared similarity is key for combating loneliness. And if that's not available to people, it can be all the more isolating.
Yeah, those are all great points. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions that everybody asked, but I think each of the speakers provided their contact information, and so you can contact them directly. I just want to thank the speakers again for spending the time and sharing some of your work. Also the audience members for sending questions and participating in the session. I'm going to hand it over to Jen to close this out.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack, and to the whole team of panelists. Your presentations were just chock full of great information. So just a reminder to participants, the slides are available. I myself will use them as reference material to go back and look at those. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We're also going to capture all these questions and use it to inform future work because, again, I think this is a big topic that we could continue to work on. Alicia's added the links to the certificate of participation and evaluations, both in English and Spanish. So with that, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our interpretation teams. We really appreciate you all joining us today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much.